Hey, CNFers, the front runner is out, and I think it's gaining a bit more traction out there. Been getting some nice texts, some emails. Turn those texts and emails into online reviews, please. An event on July 27th. There will be a live taping of the podcast featuring ya boy, B.O. CNF Pods reigns handed over to Daniel Littlewood. I don't know how I feel about that, but we'll get there. I am led to believe he's a top-notch guy. 1 p.m., Gratitude Brewing in Eugene. Go on, get yourself a front runner.
Is this a podcast where I can swear? That's the dumbest fucking shit, you know? I mean, none of the dumbest fucking shit disguised under creativity, what we are encountering.
Hey, CNFers. It's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to tellers of true tales about the art and craft of the true tales they tell. Or some shit. I'm Brendan O'Mara. You damn right. Okay, we've got Jeff Sharlet, which is pretty stunning when you think about it. I mean, this guy is the author of The Undertow, Scenes from a Slow Civil War, The Family, among other books. He often covers the far right and far right fundamentalists, and what he's been able to document is scary and often unsettling. And we don't really dig into that much. I mean, a little bit. Because mainly we just talk about doing this kind of work. It was really fun and illuminating conversation, and I'm pretty fucking stoked. Show notes of this episode and more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, there you can find links to hot blogs, tasteful nudes, and forms to sign up for the flagship Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. And the hottest thing since me in 7-inch seam shorts. From my body dysmorphia, I do have nice legs. What? Pitch Club, where I have a journalist audio annotate a pitch that earned publication. If you're a working journalist, you'll want to subscribe. If you're a journalism teacher, you'll want your students subscribing. Forever free. Welcome to pitchclub.substack.com. And if you want to support the show and its infrastructure and my ego, go to patreon.com/CNFpod. You get FaceTime with me to talk some things out, depending on your tier. It's not very organized, but it's something. God damn it, it's something. So Jeff is here. He teaches writing and creative nonfiction at Dartmouth College. That was where I desperately wanted to go to school. I was set to be their starting shortstop, but I couldn't get my goddamn SATs above remedial, and thus I attended good old UMass. Back in the late 90s, if you could funnel a beer in 5 seconds, you got a scholarship. #YOLO. In this episode, Jeff and I riff about his key influences, treating your book badly as a way of treating it well, using your outsiderness to your advantage, his love of sports writing or interest in sports writing despite not following sports, and real toads in imaginary gardens. I don't know what that is. Really good stuff. I know I say that every week, but seriously, really great stuff. You can learn more about Jeff and his work at Jeff Sharlet on Substack and his newsletter there called Scenes from a Slow Civil War. I admire people like Jeff who are just so damn smart and how they articulate things seemingly on the fly. Meanwhile, your boy B.O. sounds about as coherent as a chimpanzee. Parting shot on playing seasonal sports as a writing analogy. Stick around, it's a banger. For now, cue up the montage. Riff.
I don't even know what's in my tool belt, let alone how to use it.
Yeah, I mean, what is this genre if not hybridity?
I respect that sentence.
Is that an option? Because I choose that option.
This is going to have to interest somebody somewhere other than me.
You know, coming up as a reporter and a journalist, and in particular, like such a brilliant narrative writer yourself, you know, who were some of the reporters and authors that you really locked into early on that helped kind of pave the way for the kind of journalism that you would lock into?
I mean, there won't be original responses except in as much as I can remember the kind of the sort of precise time and space of the encounters, which is I went to Hampshire College, and my idea was to go and be an actor. And Hampshire has a pretty good art school, and so I was pretty quickly disabused of that notion by these sort of, these graduates of the Fame School in New York and so on. So, all right, I'm not going to be an actor. My plan B was to be a forest ranger. That involved too much science. Oh, great. Here's a writing class that'll fit into my schedule. And it was with a writer named Michael Lessie, who's best known as author of the 1973 book called Wisconsin Death Trip, which is still in print and has become this sort of strange kind of hybrid experiment of archival photography and clips from old newspapers and Lessie's own writing, and then a fictional character who is a town narrator. And he was teaching, it was calling it literary journalism. And, I've always been interested in all the names for this mutant genre of ours. And they're always some kind of mashup: creative nonfiction, literary journalism, lyric, essay, whatever it is. It's always a mashup. And in that class, I remember all the readings from the class. The two that were just transformative for me were James Agee with Walker Evans and Joan Didion. And I remember Hampshire College had no money, so the library was just like practically made out of cinder blocks, cinder block bookshelves. But I remember this cubicle reading James Agee's Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, and the deep subjectivity of it and the awareness and declaration from the first page that this very endeavor of nonfiction meant right from the beginning failure. And I've never, that's, and I was like, wow, something about that was like, yes, that's great. A whole genre in which I can never do anything but fail, and that's the work. But it was thrilling to me, and it was even thrilling to me to sort of like, look, he's got an oil lamp on the table in this little sharecropper's cabin in rural Alabama, and he thinks part of the story is he can't sleep, and he's going to describe this oil lamp as fully as he can. And that part of the facts and data and reporting are the associations he's bringing to this, so that he's thinking about the graves, the burial mounds, these sort of dirt graves, and there's photographs by Walker Evans of these, and he's describing it as the inverted boat, and now he's thinking about a boat and a ship. And it wouldn't be till later that I saw Agee was a screenwriter as well. And most famously African Queen, but more interestingly, Night of the Hunter with Robert Mitchum. And Robert Mitchum plays an evil preacher. If you ever know, like the old sort of love and hate meme of the hands struggling against each other, that's Robert Mitchum from Night of the Hunter. And these two little kids are fleeing, and the rest of the movie doesn't matter, but for this sort of 5-minute sequence of them floating in a boat on a river at night. They've just escaped. They don't have a paddle. And one of them is singing a song. And it's important to understand the film is to zoom in, the moment to zoom in on a spider watching them as they go by. That was reporting. That was nonfiction. And that was Agee's sensibility. So I remember that. And then Joan Didion, we read Slouching Towards Bethlehem, which is in a way, I guess, to me, in some ways, the sort of the long tragedy of my life has been having read Slouching Towards Bethlehem first, because there's other good Didion, but there's nothing like that. The White Album almost, but nothing like that. And I remember, I remember talking to a friend who was also in that class, and she was telling me she had migraines, and Joan Didion famously suffers from migraines, and she wears the big giant sunglasses, and they're very chic, but when you know about the migraines, you're like, oh, she's also hiding from the light. And the preface is Slouching. She talks about how her advantage as a writer is her profound shyness, right? That's also the sunglasses. But this friend of mine was a whiskey drinker, as I was not then, and I was impressed and admired that, and that seemed very Didion-esque to me. And my friend had migraines, and I remember this pang of idiot jealousy. I wanted migraines too, so that I could be more like Joan Didion. And I almost sort of think of my generation of writers of time, and if you were studying writing at that time, and this is a white spectrum, and I'm aware of that, but that was sort of the spectrum into which I was coming. You either wanted to be Hunter Thompson or you wanted to be Joan Didion. And with respect to those who care for Hunter Thompson, and I've come to respect that work for what it is over time, but I loathed it. I wanted to be Joan Didion. And it's Joan Didion and Agee who give me my sense as a reporter. And you speak of reporter and journalist. I didn't know I was a reporter and journalist for many years until practicing it, because I came to it through this literary journalism and this kind of narrative writing. And over time, that's intersected often enough with things that the rest of the world considered news or important, that they're like, oh, okay, I'm a reporter too. And now I very fully embrace that term. Um, and, and, and in fact, I'm teaching a class now, which is creative nonfiction, but I'm just calling it the reporters. Because if anything, I think part of, this is my grumpy old man complaint, and I'll stop, is that everything has been sort of centrifuged, so that reporting is over here and is very dry and hard news and comes from a very particular journalistic tradition, which is by no means definitive, and that creative nonfiction is over here and it's almost all memoir or personal essay. And, those writers that, going back to beginning, they weren't making those distinctions, and this mutant genre shouldn't make those distinctions. Whether we draw on fiction, we draw on poetry, we draw on everything. We do not say sharp lines. We bring it all into this space, and reporting, memoir, all of it right there at once.
I love that image of, as you say, centrifuging it, because it does feel like there's this distinction that if you're a reporter, you're like covering zoning boards and that, but the backbone of great narrative is just ironclad reporting. Like, you get those great details, and you only get those great details through that reporting, interviewing and records, and all that stuff will start to layer. Those are all the paints that you paint with, and that's what can really make something evocative, and it stems from the reporting.
A story I heard, and I'm not going to name names. It doesn't matter. You'll get the structure. So a writer who I love, and I teach this person's a particular piece by this person, and it's just this deep immersion in a place and time and people, and it's just a fantastic story. And this person had been a newspaper reporter and then had gone to an MFA program in creative nonfiction. And as the story is handed to me, they're workshopping this piece, which is astonishing. I mean, it's one of those stories that I think for some of my students functions the way Agee and Didion did for me 30 years ago. And it's so intimate to this place. And the MFA students in this class love this work, but they're puzzled. How did the writer, you're describing this moment and how this person felt and what they thought, and how did you know that? And the writer, who had been a newspaper reporter, says, I asked. I asked. And a number of the students were outraged. Well, that's not art. That's not art. And, I don't know. Is this a podcast where I can swear? That's the dumbest fucking shit. I mean, none of the dumbest fucking shit disguised under creativity. What we are encountering is a very rigid 19th century aesthetic. And it reminds me of, that term new journalism, right? It's never one word, right? New journalism, Joan Didion's a new journalist. And supposedly Tom Wolfe invents it in the 1960s. And like everything else, Tom Wolfe said it was a lie. It comes from, man, I'm not a Tom Wolfe fan. You find this phrase, and I bet Tom Wolfe knew this, conservative kind of intellectual that he was. Matthew Arnold, the British literary critic in the late 19th century, 1880s, I think, and he's got this sort of seemingly rhapsodizing description of what's happening in American journalism. And he says it's filled with, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's filled with voice and character and humor and digression. And it's this democratic rumble. And you're like, wow, this is great. And he says, and that is why it must be crushed. Because he's coming from a British conservative tradition, which is journalism is the practice of listening to experts. And art is when one goes and communes with the muse. And these must be carefully kept separate and in a hierarchy, right? So when I see that centrifuge, which I kind of have been thinking a lot about this lately. I think we're kind of in a moment, and I am being a grumpy old man, where that I see it more and more, that hardening line between creativity and reportage, which does a disservice to both, and which is sometimes framed as in service of art and ostensibly almost a progressive bent about it. That's 19th century British conservatism. And with it comes all the implicit reactionary sentiments of that world. Yeah, I mean, what is this genre if not hybridity? And hybridity is constantly mutating.
Yeah. And how have you sought to decentrifuge all that stuff in your own work and to uncrush it as the British sought to do?
And it's sort of interesting when you think about like so where is the work, where do you first come to this work, and I think I was lucky in that sense of AG and Evans. So from the very first thing, I'm like, oh, so if you're gonna, not only is it what AG is doing, but it's also Walker Evans's photographs, and I think a lot about photography. And I was studying with this man Michael Lessie, who Wisconsin Death Trip. He sort of backed into this genre. He's doing a history PhD at Wisconsin in the early 70s, but the world was collapsing. Madison, Wisconsin, the math building was blown up and someone was killed. Someone flew a crop duster over campus and dropped Molotov cocktails. Incredible political violence. And the traditions of historical narrative, which he was trained to do, weren't making sense. How do I make this story? So he didn't start from, in some ways, he didn't start from tradition. He started from the ground up. I just have this materials. How do I put it together, right? And that's how I encountered it. And that's what I see AG and Evans doing. They're sent down, if people don't know that story, they're sent to Alabama. They're working for Fortune magazine, which is its own story. Fortune magazine in the 1930s is like, oh, well, let's see, we have some economic data here. We better get a poet to write about it. I mean, they were doing all kinds of innovative things in that kind of that modernist moment of the 1930s, in which documentary collage, all this kind of stuff is coming up. They decide that to document the lives of these sharecroppers is going to mean all this other stuff, and that the photographs are not going to be the photographs, which to us are now maybe familiar because they're so iconic in American photography, but they were weird then. Wait a minute, Walker, we sent you down to document sharecropping, and you have a close-up photograph of a wall papered with magazine advertisements, or you have a photograph of a boot. Walker, what the hell is this?
Mm-hmm.
And encountering it like that, that's where I started. I think over time, making a living and making books and magazines are always those compromises. I think my favorite book of mine is a book called This Brilliant Darkness, and it began on, it's just words and pictures, because I'd always been fascinated with photography, and I started using Instagram in 2014, and I was also always interested in graphic work and in comics. And when I get stuck as a writer, I will read a superhero comic, which I loved as kids. I don't great for those. I don't collect or anything superhero comics now, but that gets me back to that space. The gutter, which is what comics artists call the space between panels, right?
Yeah.
Panel 1, Wonder Woman's about to punch someone. Panel 2, it says pal, right? And our mind sets it in motion. And when I'm stuck as a writer, I'm like, oh, I'm stuck. I need that motion between panels. And so I was looking at Instagram in 2014 and thinking, oh, look, I can't draw, but this is framed out here like a comic book, and I got about 400 words in each one of these things, and I could have a snapshot and then a picture, and I could make my own comic book. And I was just doing this in this very, just for fun way. That ended up becoming this book called This Brilliant Darkness, of words and pictures, and putting me in conversation. There's a National Geographic writer, a very good narrative writer named Neil Shea, and he had sort of stumbled on the same thing. And I think, I don't want to speak for Neil, but partly sort of, he does this wonderful work for Geographic and loves it. But there's also, if you're working in magazines, there's the thing called the nut graph. And, and he had a hashtag, killing the nut graph, right? So the photograph becomes the first sentence or the first paragraph in your story, and you don't need a nut graph. And you start thinking about going back to Didion and slouching towards Bethlehem, which is really just an array of snapshots. It's just an array of fragments. And the work of it is the juxtaposition. I put this scene here and this scene there, and I count on you to leap across that gutter to make that association. And I think that's kind of informed a lot of the prose. I mean, This Brilliant Darkness is photo and words as a prose work, but even, the last book, just called The Undertow. And on one hand, I think it's recognizable to some people because I also often write about these sort of right-wing movements. And so I know there's plenty of people reading who care less about literary journalism, creative nonfiction, craft, whatever. They just tell me about those sons of a bitches,
Yeah.
It's okay. You don't get to control how people read your book. And if they find something valuable, and it's great. But maybe they're going to notice that to tell you about those sons of a bitches, I'm writing about Ashley Babbitt, who was killed on January 6th. She was an insurrectionist and was climbing through a window, and a police officer shot her. She was carrying a knife. She was there to storm the Capitol, as she put it. And I mean, it's all like, all right, to write about Ashley Babbitt, first we write the scene of her death, right? Which I'm able to reconstruct because there's a whole lot of video, right? From all kinds of different angles. And then I'm going to go to a church, and the church is not really about Ashley Babbitt, and we're going to think about that. And then Ashley Babbitt, the insurrectionist, and when I use the F word fascist, I'm not using it lightly. That's sort of like, I don't know, you might be a Democrat. She's a fascist. Everybody's got their affiliation. And people are always surprised that her favorite movie is The Big Lebowski. and that could have been a color detail, right? But to me, I'm thinking about AG and his oil lamp, that this is part of the reporting. So part of the reporting of Ashley Babbitt and the insurrection meant me rewatching The Big Lebowski many times and thinking about that, and then seeing, The Big Lebowski, which, first time I seen it, I hadn't noticed. It's another collage of the Coen brothers, noir, Western. And so suddenly I'm going back to all these pieces, and then I'm saying, okay, well, in this book, we're obviously going to need a photograph. You're not going to be able to understand January 6th unless I tell you about The Big Lebowski. And then we got to talk about the musical scene. And then we got to have a photograph from a Busby Berkeley 1930s musical of, 100 synchronized swimmers kicking up in the air at once, right? Look, I know even describing this sort of risks incoherence and narcissism. I think you have to take that risk with the understanding that you will fail and it will collapse into that, but that sometimes you will encounter, this is to me what the genre is, the possibility of that encounter with that documentary encounter with reality that is not constricted to the 1, 2, 3, the ABC, the stack of facts, the inverted pyramid of traditional journalism.
Yeah, I love hearing you deconstruct that and be it other people's work or your own, and how you're formulating that holistic approach. And I was listening, I'm sort of a knucklehead sports writer, and I was listening to the Dan Patrick show, and he had Hall of Fame offensive tackle Joe Thomas on the show, and the way Thomas was articulating what it meant to be a pro, like leveling up to a certain level, was like he learned from some of the veterans in the locker room before him, and it was just like they taught him how to watch film, what to look for, and how to take notes to get better and better. They're all physically gifted at this point, but then there's a level of study that puts them above potentially a Hall of Famer, certainly Pro Bowlers or whatever. And I love extending that metaphor to writers too, like yourself. What is your film study, and how do you deconstruct something and so that it sticks in your brain too?
Well, now that you're saying this, Brendan, it makes me think I've got to go through your archive and find your interviews with sports writers, because this is a thing that I think is really interesting too. Because part of, when I said Matthew Arnold decrying the new journalism of the United States, one of the things he hated were the so-called the sporting gentlemen's weeklies, which were these, really sensationalist true crime and sports papers. They were not gentlemen. Gentlemen did not read these things, right? They were the Joe Rogans of their day, but Joe Rogan had not yet been invented, and they were actually engaging with this kind of narrative writing. And I think about this because I'm not, I don't follow sports in as much as I've ever been much of an athlete. It's just like, I'm going to go for a long run. But because I love this genre, it puts me in this relationship with sports writing. And I tend to think that a lot of where it comes from and gets overlooked is that early sports writing, which is doing this thing. It's like one thing to tell someone, and I think you know this as a sports writer, it's one thing to tell someone what the scores are or to speak analytically. It's another to what did it feel like to be at the fight,
Yeah.
And, at like Norman Mailer, some of his best writing is about boxing, and W.C. Hines and A.J. Liebling. I mean, boxing in particular as lending itself to that. And that kind of the 1, 2, 3 of sports writing isn't going to work, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be boring, except for anybody, a true sports fan is like, fine, that's okay. I'll run the film myself and fill in the narrative. And I think about the way sports writers are always doing that in interesting ways. And I'm just behind the screen right now as I have Wright Thompson's new book, who I know mainly as a sports writer. That's where I've encountered him, is these great portraits. But his new book is called The Barn, and it's about a barn near where he's from in Mississippi, where Emmett Till was killed. And I'm just starting it, but I'm already sort of thrilled by one digression leading to another. Like, to understand this text, The Barn, it seems almost sacrilegious to put that horrific thing in combination with, say, watching sports film, right?
Yeah.
But to understand this play, you have to understand really precisely, right? It's sort of like you better know every curve of that oil lamp, right? But you can't exclude any data, like whatever. Like, okay, so that, that oil lamp, before they were on this team, they played on this team, and they had that coach, and that coach trained there, and all this is coming into play, right? It's like the deep, deep layering. And so, I mean, I've long wanted to do it, and I haven't had the courage. I wanted to teach a course on sports writing, which would be hard because I know the students would be sports fans and I'm not, and I would know nothing except for read this beautiful piece about this person who plays this, I used to say something stupid like, read this gorgeous essay about this football match. And my students would be like, football match? What are you talking about? It's a game. But because that layering is there in sports writing, and it's there in true crime too, which is in that 19th century writing, is like, how do we write about crime? Mostly badly. I mean, and it's probably true is like most sports writing is not great. But think about you must think about this, the sports writing that is great, that we read long after anybody remembers who that athlete was. We read about games that, how many people have read about Roger Federer who could care less about tennis,
Yeah. Exactly right. Yeah. Well, Wright does that particularly well. I mean, he's made a whole career out of it. Sport as a backdrop is just such a great vector to talk about so many things, society, race, money, and everything. And and baked into it is often there's tension if there happens to be an event or a sporting event there. So there's a built-in clock often, and so much of that stuff, then you can get creative with the structure of things. So yeah, it's just something I've locked into for forever and love dissecting it. But yeah, it ends up being just a really rich way to, the best ones you come to over and over again.
I love what you say about the built-in clock, and I think I'll cite you, but I'm going to use that because I think about that. Like, you look for those moments with a built-in clock because it allows you. It does. If you're doing uncreative nonfiction, it can make for a very tedious structure. If you've got that built-in clock and the way that it allows you to play with structure, because that's there, right? That's kind of simultaneously grounding you. Like, because I think about like all these digressions. The digression always has to. That's the tension is between the built-in clock and the subjectivity of the writer going off in this other direction. I was another mutant term for this genre, the art of fact, right? And I don't even like puns, but I'm always like, wow, isn't that great. How come no one ever talks about how that sounds like an artifact?
Yeah.
But artifact, and I would think, oh, okay, so it's this tightrope, and you're balancing on this, and that's the tension. That's what makes this sort of story exciting between the built-in clock, which is the real, and the structure and the narrative that you're messing around with, which is your imagination and your perception.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's really beautifully put. And and with and I'm always looking to, I read a lot. I'm not the fastest reader, but I read all the time, and I'm often surprised at how, like, I wish that what I read could be more sticky in my head, because so often it will end up just kind of eroding from my memory, and I wonder, just for you, like when you're reading, to make things feel more sticky, in your head, how are you processing what you read and the notes you're taking, so that you can better convey it to your students, but also just for your own edification, to keep it in your head, so you can just you can pull on those threads more readily.
I remember when I was young, reading about Faulkner, who I discovered in the best way. I had a job working in a library, college library, summer job, and I was like, whatever, 16, I didn't want to do my job, so I would just hide in the stacks. And I started reading. I had vaguely heard of Faulkner, and I started reading As I Lay Dying. I'm like, oh, okay, I'll try this. And that's a weird fucking book. There's one whole chapter that is, my mother is a fish. That's it. And you're like, what? But I got pretty entranced by it. And I remember learning that Faulkner, and he was probably lying. He was a big liar. But I can't even remember the name. I think Dostoevsky was one. He had like 3 or 4 writers. He says, like, basically, I just read those over and over and over. And this was so at odds with the kind of, to be a good citizen, one must keep up with, read what others are reading. And I am drawn into the current, but I think my advice for writers, and I have a friend who's a great writer. I'm not going to name her either, because this is our disagreement. But I don't know. She started writing late in life. She didn't start she didn't start even doing magazine articles, much less books, until she was 40 or so. She lived another life. And so she had a certain amount of insecurity about literary world. And so she reads every big buzzed book, right? She reads it. And then I'll get a call. I'm like, I don't get it. This is not very good. I'm like, no, of course, that guy, that's total horseshit, that book. You don't need to read that. Well, why is everyone talking about, and maybe I know enough gossip to know how that one got sort of launched, or maybe I don't. I'm just like, like, why don't you just reread that book that you loved? And I don't want to be so conservative, like, stay and, pick your classics, because you're always adding to that canon. Like, I don't reread AJ anymore. What I reread lately, and this was a buzzed book that I resisted for a long time, H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald. And I have to admit, I saw, like, this is a book club book. That's nice. It's like reading Lolita in Tehran. It's like, that's nice. It's perfect for a book club discussion. Oh, MacDonald's book is so good. And I listened to it as an audiobook first, and I liked it so much. Then I had to read it, and then I taught it, and then I keep coming back to passages. So then it starts to stick. And of course, I don't know. It's always interesting to me with students. Not everyone has. Some people are tidier and so on. Like, bend the pages in your book, scrawl all over it. That. Treat your book badly is a way of treating it well, and you start to learn that. But the same thing, though, I will say, I think partly I don't actually have a very sticky memory, and I don't want to generalize too much, but I do feel like I know a fair number of other writers in this genre of ours who are the same, which is kind of like why we're sort of doing this, because we're like, this is like John McPhee, right? Well, I don't know if he's still alive.
I think he's 90, 91 or 92. Yeah.
I don't know if he has a sticky memory or not, but I know this one thing about him is that, he would linger in in a groove for a long time. So he's going to write about geology. He knows a great deal. And his practice, though, as I understand it, was always just to ask stupid questions. And I interpret it as both because, great, that, we want the person talking and hearing how they understand it. But also there's that kind of the vague, we're not experts, those of us who do this kind of work, right? So like, I'm never going to go into a space and say, I'm fine, I know about this. Like, what does that, I write a lot about religious fundamentalism. I was just at a church, a very fundamentalist church in Spokane, Washington, a few weeks ago. And I knew the history of this church. I knew its denominational background. I knew its theology and so on. But I'm talking to this associate pastor and I'm asking the dumbest questions, both because I want him to say it, but also because there's the anxiety of stickiness. I'm like, do I understand this? Wait a minute. You tell me again what this thing is. And and that doesn't always work, but in that case, it led to this sort of interesting space. And you can have that same relationship with the book. Is like, did I understand that again and again? I reread a poem called Poetry by Marion Moore. And there's a sports story with Marion Moore, the sports writer you'll appreciate. So Marion Moore is this high modernist, very difficult poet of the 20th century, strange, reclusive character. She wore capes. I think she lived with her mother, had this sort of deep relationship with the visual artist, Joseph Cornell, but I'm way off the factual map here, but I think it was mainly through correspondence, even though they lived close to each other. But I like to imagine this world, and again, I'm off the factual map, but there's a baseball game somewhere in there, and we're going to say it's opening games for the Yankees of, 1963, 1964. And they want somebody really, a real figure to throw out the opening pitch. And the past is a different country. There is a world in which apparently they said, hey, let's get that difficult, reclusive, high modernist poet Marion Moore in her cape to throw out the pitch. What a fucking world that was. Anyway, the poem that I keep going, Marion Moore, and she wrote this poem called On Poetry, and she just kept rewriting it for 40, 50 years. There's so many different versions. It's hard to know which version she liked best. And by the end, the last version was down to 3 lines, the first of which was, I too dislike it. And she starts from that place. So it's the same James Agee, like, look, it's never going to work. But she has this line down in the middle. She says, not until we can all be literalists of the imagination. Is that what it was? Literalists of the imagination. Till we can we have it, this poetry. And what she describes it as imaginary gardens with real toads in them. And I'm indebted for this recognition. Oh, you're describing creative nonfiction, to a friend of mine, Jeff Allred, who's a literary scholar, and he's studying sort of documentary culture of the 1930s. And he's like, imaginary gardens with real toads in them. That's it. That's what we're doing. You write about the baseball game, and Marion Moore is your real toad. 1963 or 64. Now we're getting into imaginary garden, or the structure, the clock. The clock is the real toad. The way that you narrate the event, that's the imaginary garden. I mean, if it was up to me, I wouldn't call it creative nonfiction literary journalism. I would call it, the NEH is going to give, the NEH isn't going to give grants to anybody anymore. Back in the old time when poets threw out the opening pitch and Trump wasn't president, and the NEH gave out grants, you get a grant in fiction or poetry or real toads in imaginary gardens. That would be our genre.
Oh, I love that. That's a moment ago when you were talking about going to that church in Spokane and under the theme of asking dumb questions. Oftentimes, I think a lot of journalists will feel insecure about asking those dumb questions, and this kind of gets to interviewing and all that stuff too. Just how have you contended with that feeling of, I'm gonna look or sound like an idiot, but it's all in service of setting aside that insecurity so you can let the people you're talking to, your sources, voice that for you.
I mean, you walk into a scene, a milieu, a place that is not yours. You're by definition an idiot, right? I
Mhm.
mean, literally by definition, you can't see the full horizon. Your vision, that's what an idiot is. Um, it's that I'm not speaking figuratively. That's the old term, right? You can't see the whole world, and you're trying to see. You're trying not to be an idiot, and you're in this sort of uh, you're an outsider. And as you linger in that space, you start to become an insider. You start to know things about that place. And no one likes to say this because it sounds, oh, I'm just, you will probably start to know that place better than many of the people who are there, right? Because they are wholly and naturally in their locale, but like, oh, I see this piece connects to this piece, and this person told me this, and then I read this history that you never bothered to read about your place and everything.
Yeah.
And so, but you're still an outsider. Don't forget that, even though you know more about it, you're an insider and an outsider. I mean, I think about this actually when I was saying the dumb questions, and I suddenly thought, like, wait a minute, can sports writers do that? Because you have to have trust with an athlete. If you come in and you can't say, you know, ask uh, this is how little I know sports. I'm looking for dumb terminology. I can't even get the dumb term, but you have to show, I mean, because there is some of that too, right? You show respect. Like I have some of the language here. And the same
Yeah.
thing in that Spokane church, I'm using some of the language. It says, look, I bothered to understand a
Yeah.
little bit about this. Maybe in sports writing, I wonder if you have to do even that more, but you're also always an insider outsider. Like if you're, you could be covering college basketball for 20 years, you know it probably better than any athlete you're talking to, but you don't play it. So you're an outsider. That's another one of those tightropes that I think is actually a really productive tension.
Yeah. I think what you're getting at too is being able to use the vocabulary of that subculture, even if you're not an expert in it. At least if you're speaking the language, you can kind of get them going, because in sports too. And I used to write a lot about horse racing, and that's got its own language and a weird subculture. And when the mainstream press would pick up horse racing for the Triple Crowns, the Kentucky Derby and Preakness and Belmont, you could tell they were just swooping in for that mainstream event because they just weren't using the right terms. And so you're like, oh yeah, you can tell who knows their stuff and who doesn't. So that's just a matter of, it's just immersion. It's like going to another country and you immerse yourself. Like, okay, a morning workout, an easy workout for a horse. That's when you're breezing the horse. It's a breeze. 4 furlongs in 48 seconds. And so it's one of those things that you absorb through being in that subculture, and that's something you covering religious fundamentalism, fanaticism in the country. You're like, you're steeped in it, so you can speak that language and invite the commentary that you're looking for as a journalist.
Yeah. Wait, say that furlong phrase again, will you?
Oh yeah. So like a morning workout is a breeze. And handily or sort of in hand, that's more of a stiff workout. But a mile is divided into 8 furlongs, and so typically a good workout, 12 seconds per furlong, which is almost 200 yards.
And you said 4 furlongs and 48 seconds, which is a lovely phrase. And I didn't know what it meant, but I enjoyed it. And I think that's a big part of this genre too. Is how it's sort of, if you feel constricted in your life and then you encounter in creative nonfiction, look at all this language. And here I will give a shout out. This is a student of mine yesterday, Cassidy Exner, young writer, and shared this fabulous piece with the class. And she's raised on a horse farm and is a champion equestrian, but is writing this gorgeous essay about the difference between horse people and riders. The people who show up to ride the horse that someone else has trained versus the people who are in the muck and everything. And she reads the story to the class, and I have to say probably a third of the language none of us knew, but we felt it and we loved it all. And it was such a gorgeous use of bringing us into that vernacular and that language. And I think about that too, because the way that, like with the example of fundamentalism, I'm remembering, I think this was a Times Magazine piece decades ago. And this is when I'd first started writing about fundamentalism. And I backed into that by accident too. I was writing mainly about varieties of religious experience. And I didn't think I wanted to write about fundamentalism at all, mainly because I'm like, oh, I get it. It's this guy, Jerry Falwell, Southern guy, too tight suit, pounding his pulpit, talking bullshit in a very predictable way, which is a caricature. And I was too dumb to know that, in fact, almost always where there's a caricature, you probably have a story, because it's going to be more interesting than that caricature, as the many, many varieties of fundamentalism are. But I just started getting into it, and I backed into it mainly just was writing a friend of a friend, knowing I was writing about other kinds of religion. So would you speak with my brother? He's kind of got involved in something we think is a cult, and she was from a conservative Christian family. So it wasn't that it was Christian, but it was pretty weird. And he invited me to come and live with him in this community. And so I did. And it was a kind of fundamentalism, but not in any way recognizable compared to that. And so I was writing about that. And the Times Magazine, this was in like 2003, for the ascendance of George W. Bush, the cyclical ritual of the American press going back to 1925, when it looks at fundamentalism as if it's something new. And they sent a writer down to a mega church in Arizona and writes about this piece. And I don't know this particular church, but I know it's Assemblies of God. I'm kind of puzzled because the term spiritual war, as I recall, is not in the piece. And I think I shouldn't even do this, but I think there was somewhere there was an interview with Bill Keller, then the editor of the New York Times, about this piece. And he talks about the Times going out of their way because they didn't want to exoticize this church. They didn't want to make them weird. So they left out fundamental practices like spiritual war, which is right at the heart of Assemblies of God theology, and does not mean actually hitting someone with an axe or something like that. In the same way that jihad doesn't. Jihad means personal internal struggle, until sometimes it concretizes, right? And someone takes the metaphor and flattens it and says, oh, actually, I have to get into conflict, whether it's blowing up an abortion clinic, a Christian fundamentalist, or an act of terrorism, someone who's taking jihad very literally, right? And Keller had had said that they were proud of leaving all this stuff out. Like they left. It's like they went to the horse racing and they didn't talk about furlongs or hands or all that good language.
Yeah,
because they didn't want to make it seem weird. I'm like, oh no. What you mean is you wanted to make it seem like yourself, and that means that you imagine that you're at the center, which is one of the great mistakes of American journalism. Always is to imagine that an office in Manhattan, and I have nothing against Manhattan, which I love, but to imagine that someone who went to a college like the one I'm sitting at and then went from there to an office in Manhattan, that they're the center, versus a mega church in Arizona, which is just by the numbers more the center, right? So let's go understand that language. We're not cooling the temperature by leaving out some of, and this goes actually, I think, to the point too, where I think what's interesting about creative nonfiction is there's a way in which, apart from true crime, which is almost its own thing, I think there's an unfortunate tendency to avoid conflict with the idea that conflict is a kind of sensationalism and is at odds with empathy. And I don't think that's the case. I think we're called toward empathy for the devil as much as for those with whom we agree, not out of any virtue, but simply how does it make sense? Like, I think of Carrie Howley's writing on January 6th, where Carrie Howley's a great, I think, literary journalist. Bottoms Up and The Devil Laughs, which is her very strange, weird book about Reality Winner, who was a real name. Reality Winner was a person who worked for the government, gave information on some crimes, and is now in prison. And what does it feel like to make sense to storm the Capitol, right? And when you're drawn to that level of conflict, it also draws you to an interesting relationship with language, because you have to encounter that language that might be adversarial to your very state of being. How does it make sense? How does that language account for an idea of the world? You don't have to agree with it. And in fact, you can say flat out, this is wrong. But what is wrong? What is the wrongness of it, right? What is the thing that you are saying is wrong? What does it feel like for that to make sense?
Yeah. And Even in I've heard you speak about it, and in reading the Undertow too, when you would enter, say, some of these churches, you were immediately pegged as like not one of them. It was just like a mask. Like they just like, yeah, that guy's not one of us. But still, you're there, you're immersing with them, and you're ingratiating a certain measure of trust to get people to talk. So how do you navigate those waters so that people are open to talking to you, even though you're by far an outsider to them?
I mean, that is changing right now, and I think that's one of the subtitle of that book is Scenes from the Slow Civil War. And slow Civil War, I mean, we're mostly not shooting at each other, but it's a simmer. And I know on the show you like to ask people about, sort of best writing advice they've been given. And I think back actually to that first teacher of mine, kind of lifelong mentor, Michael Lessie. And I can't even remember the story. And I was asking, like, I'm going to go, was I going to go to a sawmill? The last family-owned sawmill, which is a genre story. The last man in town who can whittle worth a damn. You find some dying craft and you go and hang out there. And I was asking Michael, should I what should I wear? What should I wear to go to the sawmill? He's like, clothes? That was the writing advice. You should wear clothes, right? Like, don't put on costumes. And it will never work. You put on costumes. Now you're not trustworthy, right? Now you're trying to put one over on them. You're going to stand out no matter what. And so you go into a church, and I'm usually, not always, usually pegged. I remember years ago working on a book, and I was in an archive, the Billy Graham archives at Wheaton College, which is an evangelical college in a very evangelical town. So everyone on this campus is evangelical. And it's Billy Graham archives. And I'm just taking a lunch break, and I'm sitting out on the steps. And this guy who turned out to be, he was a graduate student there and missions. He was learning how to be a missionary. And this guy probably never got the credit that he deserved, because I think he would the greatest missionary on earth, at least in identification. I happen to be Jewish. As a proud Jew, I don't think I look particularly stereotypically Jewish. And even if you look stereotypically Jewish, I'm on a campus where everybody's evangelical. And this guy comes up to me and says, "Have you heard the good news?" I'm like, how did you peg me? How did you know? I'm sitting in front of the Billy Graham archive. What do you mean? But you're right. No, in your sense of things, I have not. Yes, I know what you mean by it, but no, I don't share the belief. And I think that's a big part of that, like, use that outsiderness, that you come into this, like this church in Spokane. First of all, churches are getting more militant. So like in Undertow, I write about, I always just go into a church. Now suddenly I'm encountering churches where like a militiaman, an armed militiaman says, leave. Well,
yeah, like that one in Omaha.
I'm just a writer.
Yeah.
And that seemed like, but I just got a pencil. And he's like, I don't fucking care. I've got a gun.
Yeah.
And it's not good writer, bad writer, journalist. That's it. You're demonic. And this is a heightening of tensions. And I think the sad thing is people have probably imagined for a long time that those barriers were there, and they weren't. And now they are. The barriers that were imagined now are there. But in Spokane, I show up by myself. So that's a red flag. But not totally, because there's other guys who sort of wander in. This is a very militant church. They actually have a war plan. They have a written down war plan, which calls for, at some future date, don't worry, all men of fighting age who do not submit to biblical law, there's a window, and then once the window's passed, you're executed. So this is like a Handmaid's Tale level church. Not aesthetically like a Handmaid's Tale. The music is great. It's this kind of heavy metal that's pretty good. Kids running around dancing. I show up as an outsider, and which is at first a problem. The only other guy who will speak to me is another outsider who's a biker who's just gotten out of prison, and he's the guy who shows up by himself because he's just trying to keep himself afloat. He doesn't know how militant this church is. It's just a church. Please keep me sober. But eventually sort of a pastor comes on and says, hi. You're not from here. And I'm like, I'm really not. And I think so much of, like you use the term ingratiating, and look, I would be lying if I didn't say there's not some element of yeah, let's smooth these things over. I mean, this church promises to kill me in the future, but they say, hey, look, for now we can talk, right? And even then, I forget that lesson sometime. And in December, I was at a church. I'm not actually writing about churches now, but it's sort of wherever I go as a writer, I always go to a church on Sunday, not because I'm a Christian, but because how lucky, like if I'm trying to understand a place, you can go into this building where people are talking about intimate things there, and they're all and singing. You can hear people singing voices, and people who are not good singers will suddenly be vulnerable, right? That so it's just a great thing. I was at church in can't remember the town, rural North Carolina. I was curious about this church because I knew about this one was even more militant and right wing. And I start pulling down the driveway, and then two big SUVs, like I've never actually seen this in real life. It was like an action movie. They like squeal in front of me.
Yeah.
Guys come out, and they've got actually like, again, like in a movie, like Secret Service wires coming down, and they're in suits and like, what are you doing here? And I'm like, oh, well, I'm just a writer. I'm traveling through and I wanted to go to this church, and it's back and forth. And I'm like, the jig is up. There's no way they're letting me in. And they're like, well, what's your home church? And I'm like, you got me, guys. I'm a Jew. And I think it's over. And I've forgotten the berries. They get on the wires, bring them down. And I think I'm going to sit in the back, but instead I'm brought up to the front of this church, extremely right wing, but they have an idea, Israel plays a role for them in their idea of the coming revelation, the apocalypse, and so on. They start singing a song in Hebrew for me, for the Jewish gentleman who is here. I'm sitting in the front row. I don't know Hebrew. They know Hebrew. They're singing, and they're like waiting for me to sing along. And I'm like, I don't know. That's as far as I can go. And just as sort of the lesson being, right, that your outsiderness is you don't have to do a whole lot of work. In fact, you have to let your outsiderness do that work for you to sort of open those doors for you, because people recognize that you're not of that place and they wonder, who are you? What are you? And that helps them ideally. Well, who are we? What is this place that this person's? Why is this person coming here? What is interesting about us?
Yeah. Well, and I was clicking around, your wonderful Substack and some of the syllabus items that you share. I was particularly drawn because I love the art and craft of interviewing. I love hearing how people articulate it, whether they use recorders or not, and that's something I'd love to ask you in a sec. But I just love how journalists and reporters, think about how they're going to get information so they can better craft these stories. So with the Isabel Wilkerson, she has almost like this 7-layer dip of breaking down those walls and everything. So just, as that is something of a thematic backdrop to this, just how do you think about interviewing and having those conversations?
Yeah, that what's that Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Many Suns, and it's a short craft piece. And a lot of craft pieces I don't love, but this is called Accelerated Intimacy. Yeah. And I love that she calls it intimacy and just like tells young writers, that's what you're going for. Yes, you want information, but the work is to get out of the interview, right? What do you want from an interview? To get through it so you can get to the good stuff, which is the conversation. And you often, I think, have to sit there and let people like give you their official story. And you do want that information. It's useful to you, right? But probably your story is going to be somewhat to the side of that. And I think Wilkerson, by naming intimacy as the project of interviewing, and I think by doing so also alerts writers to intimate, we think of intimacy maybe in a romance or with a really close friend or a family member. Intimacy happens in all kinds of strange little spaces. And, that syllabus that I've been posting online for this class of reporters. And I started with a story that I got from this woman, Suzanne Farr, who was this organizer, and in 1970s created a radical lesbian commune in rural Arkansas, which you can imagine was maybe not the most welcoming place for that. And Suzanne she's tiny, and she has the demeanor of a sort of a Southern granny, which I can say because my granny was from Tennessee and very similar, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And she's telling this to a group of young activists. She's talking about this, and she's talking about how at the time, women in violent relationships, fleeing the relationships, where do I go in rural Arkansas? There's no shelter. I'll go to this shelter or to this commune. Maybe they'll take me in. They did. And then angry men would come with guns. And what did these women do? Suzanne Farr weighs maybe, 120 pounds. They stood their ground. And this young activist says, "Oh, that's so beautiful. You made a safe space." And Suzanne Farr, the sweet old granny, puts her hand on the young activist and she says, "Oh, honey, there are no fucking safe spaces." And the activist is shocked. And is she really some kind of right winger? No, her point is that there are safe moments, right? That's the intimacy that I think happens so often in our journalism, right? Where even you're talking across a very sharp divide, as I often do, and yet somehow we're being vulnerable with each other. And sometimes it can be a common ground. I remember talking with a QAnon enthusiast in a parking lot outside we'd been at a Trump rally. We'd kind of connected afterwards, and we're sitting in a car for 2 hours. Everyone is gone, and she really wants me to understand this stuff. So that's part of we're sitting in a car in an empty parking lot. And at one point she gets out to smoke, and she says something about shouldn't be doing this. She'd had a heart attack. I had a heart attack at a 44. It's sort of like, oh, you know, you're from New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey. You had a heart attack. I had a heart attack, right? And it's just, that's a safe moment. This is not a safe space. We're in a parking lot of a Trump rally. This is a woman who believes either she can convince me that Democrats are cannibals or I am a cannibal. Those are the binary options, right?
Yeah.
But we're in this kind of safe moment of intimacy. And I think that's what sort of interviewing, and I think what Isabel Wilkerson is so great. I mean, you see that in The Warmth of Many Suns, the profound vulnerability of these people sharing their lives with her. I think that's what we're doing. And I always record everything. Don't always use it, but I record everything because I love voices. And I love the texture of voices. And if you're recording things, and this is just my method, I have no other writers that do different things. If you're recording things, you also have a note. One, if someone like we're putting the notebooks down, we're really just listening, we can do that, right? Or if I do have the notebook, great. If it's recording, I got your words. Now I can be drawing a picture of your beard, and or the way you nod or something like that. And I can't draw very well, but they're just scribbling stick figures. This is coercive and manipulative, but there are people who feel more comfortable if they see your hand moving, writing things down, right? But then you have that little audio, and you can use that too. And you can there's a podcast. This is I really recommend, and won't be on everybody's radar because it's kind of regional, although it's listened to all over, called Rumble Strip by Erica Heilman. And she's up here in Vermont. She was a private eye, and then she got into, if I say Studs Terkel kind of thing, I mean, they're mostly, if she was going to do a story about you, it wouldn't be like what we're doing. We're, asking questions and so on. It might just be you talking. It might be sitting in a car. You hear the rain on the roof and a guy's just gotten out of prison and he's just thinking out loud. And it's so good. I think of her as a podcaster's podcaster. She's like one of those writers, like John Edgar Wideman, never sold that many books, but he's a writer's writer, everyone knows who he is. And I love the show so much. But also, if you record your stuff and you get a good little clip, Erica's always collecting sound. You can send it to her. And to me, the greatest achievement of my life is when she uses a little clip of one of my interviews. Fuck the story I'm going to write out of it. I got 2 minutes on this podcast Rumble Strip of my interview with this guy talking about his conspiracy theory about cell towers, and is gorgeous because it's put in that kind of cacophony of voices that she's collecting, and you become part of that choir.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people, I use recorders also, but will argue that it makes them lazy. I can see how you can maybe get complacent and maybe not listen. But to me, I just from my own taste and my own experience, it actually makes me a better listener, and I'm a less frustrated note taker because I'm not furiously trying to keep up with things. And then you go back to the tape, and you can hear where they have a certain inflection, which you can then italicize on the page, and just so many other things. There are just a tiny anecdote. When I was reporting this Saratoga horse racing book, way back when, I was interviewing Nick Zito, this trainer, and we were just having a conversation at the backside by his barn. And in the background, you're just hearing blue jays and you're hearing robins. And it's not a lot, but it is that little patina that adds flavor and seasoning to a scene. And I wouldn't have caught that if I was furiously keeping track of Zito, because everything that guy says, he's just a quote machine. It just pours out of him. A lot of these old horsemen, they just talk in these amazing, amazing quotes, and he is no different. It's just, I will always advocate for the recorder in that way, because for me, it frees me up. I find it more liberating than confining than some people think. Yeah.
And I'm going to, it's your anecdote, but I'm going to say the bluebirds and the robins are a lot, right? And it's just like early on, I was talking about that scene in Night of the Hunter, James Agee, and a big part of the scene, I mean, the kids are fleeing the evil preacher. That's the plot. But really, they're just on the boat on the river, and the camera lingers on a spider as they pass by. And that's a lot. That's what this genre is. That is outside the who, where, when, what, why of the horse trainer that you're writing about. But it's so much. And when you hear that stuff, when you hear it on playback, which you may not have noticed is exciting, but I also think maybe for me, what has worked as the antidote to laziness, because I get that though. But maybe if you start to think like, I even though you are a podcaster, I'm not, but I'm alert because I love listening to podcasts, and I love listening, I think shows obviously like This American Life and so on, which are using not just the words, but the atmospheric sound or the intonation, right? If you're alert to that, like if you're just thinking about that always, you're not lazy when you're recording, because you're just thinking someone said, Zito is sitting there talking, and there's bluebirds behind at the same time. This is going to be some great audio, right?
Yeah.
And it brings you more. There's a way in which the recorder, instead of being an excuse to tune out, can be just a zoom into the moment. And I think you can kind of train your ear to do that you don't have to be a professional podcaster to do that. You just have to be someone who likes listening to them.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And then with my notebook is so many times, and I do this when I'm doing interviews of this nature, but also if I'm doing more reporting type conversations, it's just like, oh, they said something really cool. I'm like, I'm going to put a pin in that. And, otherwise, I would miss so many opportunities to follow up if I didn't have the recorder there to like catch everything, and then I can be selective later. And this way, notebook, okay, that was a really cool word there. I'm going to circle back to that, but I don't want to interrupt them right now. And then when they're kind of done with that thought, it's like, okay, you said something really cool. Let's kind of like unpack that a little more. I would miss that if I didn't have a recorder. And that's just for me and my skill, but in others Darcy Frey, he definitely didn't use a recorder for the last shot. Old guards like McPhee and Talese don't use them, and scores of others. But I mean, we're kind of circling the same
Those
same
are
thing
also
here.
people who are coming from an era of schooling in which you learned shorthand, which I did not. So
me neither.
So there's that advantage too. My teacher Michael Lessie, his whole method, a great and out of print book of his called Forbidden Zone, which is just sort of going and hanging out with people who work with death in different regards. There's a beautiful chapter about a slaughterhouse. And, he would just go and spend time in the slaughterhouse, and then he would leave. And then as soon as he'd pull over as quick as he could, and then he'd write down everything, but that was his way of accessing the subconscious as well, and he said this, and he said this, and my left foot itched, no editing at all, right? Complete. And, you can do that as well as with recording too. I think what you're looking for is the thing that lets you be as present and as just exhilarated to the peculiarity of this moment. And
Yeah.
I should say, I have to get going, but so here's my last anecdote, because it's my first recorded interview. His name was, I think, Ed Sadlowski. I was in college. And my father had a reel-to-reel tape machine that could be hooked up to a phone. And he was a legendary, I'd read about him. He's a legendary leader, labor leader, and should have been the president of the steelworkers, but it was a crooked election. There was a murder, everything. And this guy talked so beautifully to me on the phone for an hour and a half, and I'm watching the reels going, and he's just he's describing this other world that isn't. It's elegiac, it's utopian, but it's all in this gruff, like Midwestern steelworker's voice, and it's fabulous. And of course, I get off, and I can't wait to hear it back, and I've completely fucked it up. And the tape is blank. I did try and call him back and say, Mr. Sadlowski, could you please say those things again? It's like, what the fuck, kid? So, so that's not a story of successful, but the thing about the recording it does is it reminds you this was a moment in space and time, right? This was not just things that Zito said, right? This is a moment when this bluebird sang that note, right? And however you can get to that space and time, to me, that's the method, whatever it is for the writer.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, Jeff, I'm such a great admirer of your work, and I'm so happy that you're able to carve out a little more than an hour here to just talk shop about how we go about this kind of work. So just thanks so much for the time and everything you do.
Thank you, Brendan, and it's good talking to you. And I'm gonna go digging in your archives for sports, especially. I mean, all your archives, but I want to think more about sports writing. And then I'm going to press on you. If I ever teach this class, I'm going to ask you to come in and speak to it about that in particular, because I think there's a Rosetta Stone of creative nonfiction there in sports writing.
Well, I'd be honored and thrilled to do so. So any time.
Thanks. Take care.
Yes. Awesome. Can you believe it? Jeff might invite me, Lil owe me, to talk sports writing if he teaches the course. I'm going to Dartmouth after all. Suck it, Coach Whalen. I'm so kidding. You just retired as the single winningest baseball coach at a single institution in Ivy League history. Curse my public school mouth. Yes, thanks to Jeff for coming on the show. Really fun. I love when people discover they can swear on the show and then they just start dropping F-bombs. I have to imagine it's like taking your bra off at the end of a long day. Exactly like that. This parting shot hit me while I was on a run, as many of mine do. That's why I run with a notebook and a pencil and my shame. Many of us athletes of a certain age, we never specialized in a sport. Maybe very late in our careers, but not early. Not from the start. For me, in the fall, it was soccer. In the winter, it was either indoor soccer or indoor track. And spring and summer, for me, was baseball. Each season brought a different focus and different way of moving the body through space, different skills, different planes of movement. Yes, there was likely one sport that you wanted to be great at, but playing a different sport in a different season didn't detract the skills from the other. It actually made you a better athlete. And better athletes can leverage sport-specific skills better than most. I bring this up because many of us as writers, we tend to stay in one particular lane, right? We identify as a writer of personal essays or memoir, or biography, or narrative journalism. And we feel that maybe a word written outside of that is wasted. I was on a podcast last week when we were off mic, the host told me how he can't read a single word of fiction. Being a nonfiction guy himself. And while I said I understood his affinity for sticking with nonfiction as his bread and butter, I offered that in reading fiction, we as nonfiction writers can really level up our prose, and as reporters seeking a greater sense of our source's interiority can perhaps be better probing interviewers to ask questions that reach the depths of the human experience. That's how I like to read fiction. But I challenge me even to play a different sport now and again. I'm more of a narrative journalist and biographer. The occasional personal essay, a humor piece, craft piece here and there. But in the spirit of hanging up the bat and glove for a particular season, maybe scribbling some short stories, maybe a screenplay, a television pilot, maybe poetry. I try to write like humor poems, which I think is a lane most writers avoid. Not your boy B.O. though, LOL. Or maybe it's just fucking around making videos. I don't know. On the surface, maybe you're thinking you can't waste a moment on other elements of art and style because you haven't quite arrived where you want to be with your bread and butter. But I have a feeling that playing a different sport from time to time will reinvigorate your energy and level up the thing that's more on brand, you know? Sometimes the thing is a drag and bums you out, which probably means you're putting too much pressure on yourself and burning out. When I ran a couple of seasons of indoor track, I did it mainly because I wanted to be a faster runner for baseball. It sucked lining up in the 300-yard dash knowing that I was going to get my ass kicked by actual track athletes. I quit after 2 years, but I should have stayed on. I could have met some, I could have maybe gotten a little bit quicker, or I could have, at the very least, maybe met some cute sprinter girls from other schools, since I wasn't there to be a high performer. God damn it, B.O. You wasted your time. You wasted your damn life. Too many kids specialize from a young age in sports, and I don't know, that strikes me as kind of boring and kind of sad. But that's neither here nor there. But I think you get the idea. You get the premise. So stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do interviews, see ya.